But the greatest Viking ship ever found was discovered on home soil in southern Norway, purposefully buried beneath the earth for one last voyage, carrying 2 women on their way to the realm of the dead.
Beneath the earth in Scandinavia, a Viking ship had been hidden for more than 1,200 years, untouched and full of secrets. When scientists finally opened it, they found more than old wood or metal. They found preserved bodies that revealed a dark and strange ritual. The way the bodies were arranged and the objects around them told a story of power, death, and sacrifice. Every item seemed to have a purpose. Every detail showed meaning. What drove the Vikings to perform such terrifying rituals? And what secrets did they hope would stay buried with the dead? Join us in this video as we reveal the details. The preserved bodies in a 1,200 old Viking ship reveals dark ritual. In 1904, on a quiet stretch of farmland known as Oseberg Farm, an ordinary task led to an extraordinary discovery. A farmer was digging drainage ditches through thick blue clay. There was no expectation of uncovering history. There was no sign that anything unusual lay beneath the soil. Yet as his shovel cut into the earth, it struck wood, not fresh timber, not the remains of a recent structure. This wood was dark, ancient, and deeply buried. Word of the discovery quickly reached scholars at the University of Oslo. Soon, Professor Gabriel Gustafsson and his team arrived to examine the site. What they uncovered over the following months would become one of the most important archaeological finds in Scandinavian history. Slowly and carefully, as layers of soil were removed, the shape of a ship began to appear. It was not broken apart or scattered. It was whole. It had been deliberately placed into the ground. The vessel, later named the Oseberg ship, measured approximately 21.5 meters in length and about 5 meters in width. It had been built from oak around the year 820 AD. The craftsmanship was detailed and refined. Its prow curved upward in a smooth spiral, ending in a carved serpent head. The planks overlapped in a method known as clinker building, and iron rivets secured each section. The design suggested that the ship had been built not only for travel along coasts and rivers, but also for display. It was both practical and symbolic. The ship had been dragged inland from the fjord and placed carefully into a prepared trench. It was then covered with peat and thick clay. The wet soil created an environment without oxygen, which slowed the decay process. Because of these conditions, the ship survived in a state that surprised even experienced archaeologists. It was not simply recognizable, it was remarkably well preserved. However, the vessel itself was only part of the discovery. Inside a wooden burial chamber constructed amidships, excavators found an extraordinary collection of objects. There were 4 elaborately carved sleighs, each decorated with intricate animal designs. A wooden cart with decorated wheels was discovered, later identified as the oldest known example of its kind in Scandinavia. There were woven tapestries featuring complex imagery that scholars would debate for decades. There were cooking tools, farming equipment, storage chests, and even a full bed with carved animal head posts. Around the ship lay the remains of sacrificed animals. 15 horses had been slaughtered and buried with the vessel. 6 dogs and 2 small cows were also interred. The number of animals alone suggested considerable wealth. Horses, in particular, were valuable for transport, agriculture, and warfare. To sacrifice 15 indicated access to significant resources. At the center of the burial chamber lay 2 female skeletons. One appeared to have died between the ages of 45 and 50. The other was significantly older, estimated between 70 and 80 years of age. Although their clothing had mostly decayed, impressions in the clay suggested fine fabrics. Some fragments hinted at silk, possibly imported from distant regions through trade routes. Based on the richness of the grave goods and the scale of the burial, archaeologists concluded that these women must have held high status. In the early 20th century, scientific tools were limited. There was no DNA testing. There was no isotope analysis to study diet or origin. There were no CT scans to identify trauma hidden within bone. Conclusions were drawn from visible evidence and interpretation. The interpretation that took hold was clear and powerful. The burial was believed to be that of 2 noble women, possibly queens. The story fits the objects. It fit the dramatic setting. It also fits the national mood. Norway, like other European nations, was strengthening its identity and looking to its Viking past for symbols of pride. The idea of powerful Viking women buried with grandeur supported both academic and cultural narratives. Over time, the two skeletons became widely known as the Oseberg Queens. Museums displayed the ship as a symbol of female authority in a society often portrayed as dominated by male warriors. Textbooks repeated the interpretation as an established fact. Visitors from around the world viewed the vessel and imagined royal women commanding respect in life and honor in death. For more than 100 years, this interpretation remained largely unchallenged. The burial stood as a monument not only to Viking craftsmanship, but also to a particular understanding of Viking society. If the ship, the treasure, and the burial mound told a story of royal honor and power for more than a century, then what would happen when modern science finally began to test that story against the silent evidence hidden inside the bones themselves? Let's find out. Scientific re-examination and a changing interpretation. Throughout much of the 20th century, the skeletal remains from the Oseberg burial were stored rather than thoroughly examined. The bones were fragile. The burial environment, while preserving wood and artifacts, had leached minerals from human remains. Early anthropological studies in the 30s and 40s provided only limited information, mainly confirming approximate ages. There was also a reluctance to disturb the established narrative. The Oseberg burial had become a cultural treasure. To question it would mean revisiting decades of scholarship and museum presentation. However, by the early 2000s, advances in scientific technology created new possibilities. In 2007, researchers at the University of Oslo initiated a comprehensive re-examination of the remains. Modern DNA extraction techniques have improved significantly. Stable isotope analysis could now reveal information about diet and geographic origin. CT scanning allowed detailed internal imaging of bone structure. Chemical testing could identify traces of substances and indicators of nutritional stress. The first major findings came from DNA analysis. The younger woman displayed genetic markers associated with Eastern European ancestry. At first glance, this was not necessarily unexpected. Viking trade routes extended far eastward. However, stable isotope testing revealed that she had lived most of her life in Norway. Her diet matched local patterns. She was not a recently arrived foreign bride. She had grown up within Norwegian conditions. The older woman's DNA indicated Scandinavian ancestry. Yet her isotope profile revealed something unusual. The carbon and nitrogen ratios in her bones showed a diet heavily dependent on marine protein. While fish was common in Scandinavian diets, individuals of elite status typically consumed a broader range of foods, including livestock and agricultural products. A diet dominated by fish suggested more limited access to varied resources. Further testing confirmed that the two women were not biologically related. They were not mother and daughter. They were not sisters. They shared no close kinship. Medical analysis revealed additional details. The younger woman showed signs of a hormonal disorder that affected skeletal development. The older woman suffered from severe arthritis, indicating prolonged pain and restricted mobility. These findings suggested lives marked by physical difficulty rather than comfort. CT scans uncovered healed fractures on the younger woman's skull, particularly around the eye, orbit, and jaw. The pattern of injury indicated repeated blunt force trauma delivered from above. The fractures had healed long before death, but the injuries were significant. The evidence pointed toward interpersonal violence rather than accidental injury. Chemical analysis of bone tissue revealed markers consistent with childhood malnutrition in both women. Stress indicators in their skeletons suggested years of physical labor. These findings stood in contrast to the idea that they had lived privileged lives of leisure. As researchers compared the Oseberg findings with other Viking ship burials, a broader pattern began to emerge. In several cases where multiple individuals were buried together, secondary individuals displayed signs of trauma, malnutrition, and lower social status. Scholars revisited historical accounts, particularly the writings of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who in 922 described witnessing a Rus funeral on the Volga River. He recorded that a slave girl was chosen to accompany a deceased chieftain into death. She was intoxicated and then slaughtered before burial beside the elite individual. For many years, his account had been viewed as exaggerated. However, archaeological evidence from Viking burials increasingly showed parallels. The cumulative findings from the Oseberg re-examination did not conclusively identify the precise social roles of the two women. However, they significantly weakened the long-standing interpretation of royal status. The wealth within the grave may have reflected the status of a primary elite figure. Yet the biological evidence suggested that at least one of the women experienced hardship, violence, and limited resources during her lifetime. This reevaluation demonstrated how archaeological interpretations can evolve. The original conclusions of 1904 were shaped by available evidence and cultural context. Modern science introduced new data that complicated the earlier narrative. The Oseberg burial remains one of the most important Viking discoveries ever made. However, its meaning has shifted. What was once presented confidently as the resting place of two queens is now understood as a more complex and uncertain case. If the Oseberg burial revealed the hidden truths of women long thought to be queens, what darker secrets might lie beneath other Viking mounds, where fire and destruction erased every trace of those who once lived? Stay tuned for more. The destruction of the Myklebust ship burial. For more than 1,000 years, a very large burial mound stood in the area now known as Nordfjordeid. The mound was called Rundehogen. It was more than 30 feet high and around 100 feet wide. It was one of the biggest mounds in the region, and it stood out clearly in the landscape. Beneath this mound were the remains of what later became known as the Myklebust ship, a large Viking ship burial. For many generations, local people were afraid of the mound. Stories were told that smoke sometimes rose from it at night. Some claimed there was a strange smell coming from the soil. Farmers said their animals did not want to walk near it. One story said that a young boy climbed the mound and later became sick and died. These stories made people believe the mound was cursed. Because of this fear, no one disturbed it for centuries. It remained closed and untouched, not because people forgot about it, but because they were afraid of it. In 1874, the mound was finally opened by Anders Lorange, a Norwegian naval officer and archaeologist. At the time, other Viking ship burials had already been found in Norway, including the Gokstad ship and later the Oseberg ship. These graves had well-preserved ships and many rich objects. Because of this, Lorange likely expected to find something similar at Rundehogen. What he found was very different. Instead of a whole ship, the excavation revealed thick layers of charcoal spread across the mound. Over 700 iron rivets were discovered during the first digging. Later studies counted more than 1,300 rivets in total. These rivets showed that a large ship had once been there. However, no wooden structure remained. The ship had not simply rotted away. It had been burned. The soil showed clear signs of strong heat. The fire had been intense enough to destroy almost all of the wood. Weapons were found broken into pieces. Shields were crushed. There was no clear order in how the objects were placed. Nothing appeared carefully arranged. The scene looked more like destruction than a careful burial. The damage did not seem accidental. It appeared deliberate. Among the burned remains, archaeologists found cremated bones placed inside a bronze container that had also been damaged by heat. The bones were identified as belonging to a man who was likely between 30 and 40 years old when he died. The cremated remains were covered by 12 iron shield bosses. Instead of being displayed in a proud or symbolic way, the shields seemed to be stacked over the bones. There were no clear personal belongings found with the man. No jewelry was reported. No religious symbols such as pendants or Thor's hammer amulets were identified. No clothing fragments survived. There were also no other human bodies buried alongside him. During the 1874 excavation, no clear animal sacrifices were recorded either. The burial did not show signs of celebration or honor. Instead, it appeared simple and stripped of personal identity. When this burial is compared to other Viking ship graves, the difference becomes clear. The Oseberg ship contained rich carvings, fine textiles, animals, and many valuable objects. The Gokstad ship included weapons, tools, games, and several sacrificed animals. In Denmark, the Ladby ship also showed strong signs of high status, even though it had been looted long ago. In those graves, the ship and objects helped tell a story about the person buried there. They showed power, wealth, and importance. At Myklebust, that story is missing. The ship was destroyed by fire. The objects were broken. There were no clear signs of status or religious meaning. Many important items that are usually found in Viking burials were absent. Because the ship was burned so badly, much information was lost. Without preserved wood, clothing, or clear object placement, it is difficult to fully understand what happened at the site. What remains is a burial that feels incomplete. The size of the mound and the number of rivets show that it was once large and important. However, the strong burning, broken weapons, and lack of personal items create a very different picture from other well-known Viking graves. While some Viking leaders were violently erased from history, how did other cultures honor their dead with ships? And what can these burials tell us about power, belief, and society across the ages? Let's delve deeper. The legacy of ship burials across cultures. Ship burials have been used by many cultures for a very long time, even before the Vikings. In different parts of the world, people buried important leaders and nobles in ships. In Anglo-Saxon England, the Sutton Hoo site had a large ship burial from the 7th century. It contained gold, jewelry, weapons, and other valuable items. The Egyptians buried pharaohs with real or model ships so they could travel in the afterlife. The most famous is the Khufu ship near the Great Pyramid of Giza. In China, during the Han Dynasty, noble people were sometimes buried with decorated wooden ships. These ships could help them travel to the world of the immortals as seen in the Mawangdui tombs. In the pre-colonial Philippines, chiefs and nobles were buried in big boats with servants, weapons, and treasures, then covered with earth to make burial mounds, according to the Boxer Codex. In Siberia, nomads like the Sayans and Pazyryks buried their leaders in carved wooden ships, covering them with planks and earth. Across these different societies, ship burials showed that the dead were important, and that ships had symbolic meaning, representing journeys, status, and rituals. The Vikings had their own beliefs about life after death. They thought the world had 9 realms, each ruled by a different god or goddess. Brave warriors who died in battle could go to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would eat, drink, and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. Others who died honorably might go to Freya's hall, while some went to Hel, a shadowy and cold underworld. Vikings also believed a person's soul had several parts, like the mind, the body form, and the spirit animal. These parts could travel separately, and people could even use magic to influence them. These ideas shaped how Vikings buried their dead and what they included in the grave. Ship burials in Viking culture were usually for people of high honor, such as kings, queens, warriors, or chieftains. They placed the deceased inside a ship with grave goods like weapons, jewelry, textiles, animals, and sometimes servants. The items showed their wealth and importance. The ship itself represented the journey to the afterlife and showed how important the sea was in Viking life. Ship mounds were usually near rivers or coasts, linking land and water. They were also visible symbols of power for the person buried and their family. Some Viking ship burials are older than the Viking Age. The Herlokshaugen burial on the island of Lika, Norway, is from about 700 CE. It had a large wooden ship buried under earth and stones. Archaeologists found a seated skeleton, a sword, animal bones, a bronze kettle, and charcoal layers. Iron rivets helped date the ship to before the Viking Age. The person buried was likely a leader, such as a king, chieftain, warrior, priest, or trader. This shows that ship burials were connected to status, ritual, and power long before the Vikings became famous. The items in Viking and early ship burials give clues about daily life, wealth, and culture. Weapons and tools show what people used for fighting and work. Jewelry, textiles, and imported goods show trade and wealth. Some items may have had religious or symbolic meaning. Animals like horses, dogs, and oxen were sometimes included, probably as sacrifices to honor the dead or to serve them in the afterlife. Ship burials also show that Vikings were explorers, traders, and diplomats. Grave goods from other lands suggest connections through trade, raids, or agreements. People buried in ships may have helped trade goods like furs, metals, amber, slaves, and spices. They may also have helped settle disputes or negotiate between groups. These burials show not only personal wealth and power, but also the wider connections and influence of Viking society. From all this evidence, it is clear that ship burials were very important. They were not just graves, but symbols of power, wealth, and belief. They showed respect for the dead and helped them on their journey to the afterlife. What do you think about the Vikings' burial? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us as we uncovered the remarkable and mysterious world of the Vikings and their extraordinary ship burials. If this deep dive gave you a greater understanding of their culture, beliefs, and the people behind the legends, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video on your screen to explore more stories. See you there.